View from the Wing. My name is David Gunther, and I am recently the Executive Director of the Mackinac Center's Workers for Opportunity. All of you for being here today. Today's topic and format's a bit different than what we typically do with these Issues and Ideas forums. We hope you will find it interesting, informative, and timely. Our guest today is Gary Leff, the founder of View from the Wing, one of the leading websites on travel industry trends and credit card rewards. In addition to blogging about his miles and points obsession, he co-founded InsideFlyer.com, a place for frequent flyers to meet and learn using the latest technology. He's been called an air genius and an air industry brainiac who might be thought of, or you might think of as the Aaron Silver of, or Nate Silver of his domain. He has also been called sagacious by legendary travel writer Joe Brancatelli and the godfather of the frequent flyer hobby in Rolling Stone. Ron Lieber in the New York Times describes him as a travel industry blogger with a specialty in spanking companies that devalue their loyalty programs, and says that his trenchant blogging about the airline industry gives some executives fits. Yahoo Travel declared, "This guy knows points." Gary serves as the chair of the nominations committee and MC for the Freddie Awards, and was named one of the world's top travel specialists by Condé Nast for his award booking service, bookyouraward.com. Gary has been a featured speaker at credit card industry conferences. His credit card advice has been featured in places like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. Outside the travel arena, he is former chairman of a nonprofit that provides networking and professional development opportunities for young people in policy, politics, and journalism, and currently serves as the treasurer for two nonprofits. Through a nonprofit fundraising practice, he has written under the signatures of two majority leaders of the U.S. House of Representatives and a future vice presidential candidate and Speaker of the House. As hard as it may be to believe, those are all side hustles. In his day job, he is chief financial officer at a major university research center, where he's fortunate to work alongside several Nobel laureates in economics, a director of the Congressional Budget Office, and a member of the 9/11 Commission. Over the next hour, Gary and I will have a wide-ranging conversation on the past, present, and future of flying and travel. He will share his deep knowledge of aviation economics, airline loyalty strategies, and the quirks of government travel regulation. Witty, insightful, and unafraid to challenge conventional wisdom, Gary blends deep economic analysis with practical advice for travelers. Whether you're curious why airline prices swing so widely, what seat to book for your next trip, or how government policies affect where and how you fly, this event promises to be an engaging tour through the fascinating world of travel. We will leave some time at the end of the program for your questions, so if there's something that he is on your mind, or something he says or I say that merits follow-up, put it on the card in front of you, and one of our staff will come by and I will facilitate those during the Q&A. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to Lansing and the Michigan Freedom Embassy, Mr. Gary Leff. Okay, Gary, let's start off with the obvious. The federal government has been shut down for more than a month. You flew in yesterday from my former home of Austin, Texas. How was that experience compared to when government was open?
So yesterday was a non-issue for me. No delays. Security wasn't taking very long. It was a Wednesday. It was a Wednesday in the morning. It's a relatively light travel day. Before the pandemic, you had real peaks and valleys in air travel, where Monday morning was very heavy, Friday afternoons and even Thursday afternoons were very heavy. Sunday was a tremendous crush, and the middle of the week there wasn't very much. Things have evened out quite a lot, but still, Wednesdays are very much a lull, and much of that evening has to do with greater flexibility that people have in their jobs. They may not be in the office every day, or they may be able to work remotely more, and so they might travel with their families and work wherever they are on the Friday, and so people may take longer weekends. But as I say, Wednesday is still a lull. Not a big deal for my travel. But the way back tomorrow may be a different story, and I can tell you what I'm doing. That. Right? So what we all know now is happening is the FAA has said we need to reduce flying across the board at 40 of the large airports in the country. And it's a little bit of a weird take. So what we've seen happen is during the shutdown, air traffic controllers are considered essential government workers or TSA employees, and so they're working. They're not getting their paychecks. It's deferred until the shutdown ends. So they're accruing the hours. They will be paid, but they're not being paid right now. And so people are calling out sick in large numbers. And a couple of things go into that. One is that in the beginning of 2019, during the government shutdown basically ended when air traffic controllers didn't show up at New York TRACON and a couple of other facilities in the Northeast. And so that crushed air travel, and it crushed it specifically, where members of Congress were going to be flying and where the media was covering it, right? So that very day is when they ended that shutdown. The other piece of it is people aren't getting checks, and many of them are doing things like picking up gigs at Uber. Now they're going to be paid for these hours that they're not working eventually, but in the meantime they need to have some cash flow, and so they're just not showing up to work. Plus they say, look, it's really stressful. Other people aren't showing up. It puts more load on me. You don't want to stress people in the working air traffic control, and so this is what I'm going to call out. All right, so we've been seeing people call out. And it goes from airport to airport on a given day where there aren't enough air traffic controllers staffing, and they're short on controllers to begin with, right? And so we've had a lot of delays, a lot of cancellations. What we're now seeing is a reduction across the board at major airports, even where those airports aren't necessarily going to be short on controllers on a given day. And that doesn't help in airports where they're not where they are short, because the FAA has fought the use of remote towers. They could be using technology that allows controllers to be anywhere, but they've pushed back against that and been unwilling to do it, even when Congress has told them to, and they were told to in the last FAA reauthorization. But what it does actually accomplish is reduce pressure on some of the en route centers rather than the airport specific centers, just by reducing the number of flights that are going across the country. What flights are going to get canceled are going to be primarily out of airports like Lansing. And the reason for that is they want to reduce the number of takeoffs and landings, and they want to do it where they're affecting the least number of people. And that means smaller aircraft, right? So first, international flights are exempt from this, and international flights are going to be using less air traffic resources in the US. North of, say, East Coast Europe, right? There's not as much en route center usage as if they're going across the country. West Coast to Trans-Pacific destinations, the southern states down to Mexico, these kinds of flights, they'll use less. International is exempt. And airlines are going to want to maintain as many passengers as possible. For the most part, they're going to be focused on maintaining their larger aircraft. And so tomorrow morning, I'm scheduled to fly out of Lansing. We don't know yet whether these flights are going to be canceled or which flights are affected, because, of course, the shutdown could end today, in which case this doesn't happen. So what I did is I was scheduled to fly Lansing, Chicago, Austin. I bought myself a ticket from Detroit to Austin. Now, Austin's actually not on the list of 40 airports, and it's based on arrivals. Detroit is on the list. Flights out of Detroit should be fine, except getting back may not be. Nonetheless, they're probably not going to be getting rid of, dumping mainline flights between a hub and a focus city that Delta has. So if my flight goes out of Lansing, I'm good. If it isn't going to go, I drive to Detroit. Now, why am I doing this? First of all, within 24 hours, I can cancel a ticket for a full refund. And the airlines aren't required to honor that within 7 days of travel if you're buying within 7 days of travel, but the Delta and United both will. So I bought the ticket this morning, and if I don't use it tomorrow, I get a refund. Then the other thing to consider is, even if that wasn't the case, airlines during the pandemic, except on their basic economy fares on US routes, got rid of, for the most part, change fees. So one of the strategies you can employ at peak times, when planes are full and you're not going to be able to get on their flights, is consider buying a ticket on a second airline. My favorite way to do it is with points, because I can cancel without a fee, redeposit the points. It's like getting a full refund rather than getting a travel credit. So maybe I'll buy a ticket on points for several hours later, right? And if my first flight goes, I cancel it, I get the points back. You might think, is this like kind of okay to do? But I wrote about it this morning because the CEO of Frontier Airlines actually recommended doing it. Right. So it's like you have an airline CEO coming out and say, like, is it fair to the airlines to buy tickets you don't intend to fly? Well, he's actually hoping that people then just go out and buy tickets that aren't refundable, but that will turn into travel credits on his airline. But so he's suggesting it. So I think it's kind of okay for me to tell you this as a suggestion. So that was what I did.
Related to that, with the issues with airport security, or with the air traffic control, you've got airport security. The backlog seemed to be getting longer as time goes on. 2 weeks from now is the 24th anniversary of the creation of the Transportation Security Administration. Why is airport security still such a problem?
So there's a couple things. I mean, obviously right now there's people for the same reason as air traffic control are calling out sick. TSA screeners are as well. And so in Houston, we had 3-hour lines for pre-check. It was crazy, right? Because you just didn't have people to process it. They're shutting down lines. They're operating fewer lines. They can't get the throughput through. But more fundamentally, there's actually something very similar in air traffic control and airport security that we have in this country that is somewhat anachronistic relative to the rest of the world, and why we don't perform as well in either one. Both are functions that are performed by the government and not just regulated by it. And believe it or not, that's not how it works in much of the world. And so Canada, air traffic control NAV Canada is a private nonprofit. In the UK, it's actually just a private business, NATS in the UK, air traffic controls. But most of the world, airports are very frequently privately owned. Airport security is privately contracted. There are some airports in the US where it's private contractors, like San Francisco, for instance, being the largest one. There is a program that allows it, but even there, the TSA tells the airport what contractor to use. They don't get to run their own bidding process. They don't get to pick for performance reasons. What you have, it's basically not to best world standard to have the same entity even regulating and performing the function, right? Regulating itself. It's a recipe for very little accountability. And that's what we've seen. In air traffic control, we've had a situation, they've known they've been understaffed for 20 years. There's not enough throughput to train new controllers. They can hire new controllers, but that's a 2-year wait to get into the FAA Academy. And there are other things they can do, which at the end of the last administration, the FAA Administrator Michael Whitaker started to do, which was work with university programs in air traffic control to allow some of those credits to count so that they could start their direct training rather than going through the FAA Academy where they didn't have the seats, but they hadn't expanded the capacity in 20 years to train more controllers, even though they've known that this is a problem. Air traffic control uses incredibly outdated technology in this country. We're still using paper flight strips, right? Tracking like planes on paper instead of computer in most centers. And we don't have a plan to get rid of that in many of the large airports until the 2030s, right? We're using software machines often from the 1960s. Despite having spent tens of billions of dollars in modernization efforts. It's not that we haven't spent money, although it's also the case when you have a government air traffic organization that is relying on annual appropriations. That's not really the best way to do big capital spending projects. Right? What NAV Canada does is they issue bonds backed by the revenue that's charged to the airlines for their services, right? And they can do long-term technology projects that way. But the FAA is also just really bad at managing them. So they go, instead of buying off-the-shelf software like much of the rest of the world uses for their air traffic control, they go to work groups and ask, well, what do you want in the software? And everything has to be designed to spec. And these processes take years. And by the time that they come to conclusions about the specs and the software gets built, it's already completely outdated. And then they also have huge change orders along the way. And so they don't make progress rolling these things out. And the stuff doesn't work as well as it's supposed to. And so there's just not a very good, I think, management culture around technology projects, and this leads us hugely behind the rest of the world. Like, a lot of this has to do with where's the accountability. So even if you didn't say follow the Canada model in privatizing air traffic control with a stakeholder nonprofit, even if you just separated out the entities that were performing the function, right, you would likely do better. And interestingly, in the last government shutdown, the controllers union supported privatization. You wouldn't normally expect this, but they realized now if Canada's paying their controllers, right, so they don't have to go through this period of shutdowns where they go without pay in a private entity. So it wasn't working very well for them. Plus, they wanted better technology, like to do their jobs better. So
Detroit is a major hub for Delta Airlines, which is doing very well financially, and a key city for Spirit Airlines, which is in bankruptcy again and trying to stave off liquidation. Ultra low cost carriers like Spirit seem to work well in different parts of the world in different niches, but other areas they don't. What do you count for that?
Well, so there's a lot of things going on. Some of them are specific to Spirit and some to low cost carriers broadly. Spirit Airlines, I actually think, lost some of its focus on its low costs. So start of the pandemic, they actually opened a new corporate campus with several brand new buildings. Like, they're just not the low cost mindset that they once were compared to Frontier Airlines. Frontier does their flight attendant training at a truck stop in Wyoming. Okay, because it's like cheaper than using their Denver headquarters. They know what they're about, right? They are about keeping costs down. Spirit, I think, lost some of that focus. Low cost carriers also have some cost issues that have reduced the spread of costs relative to more larger legacy airlines. One thing was post-pandemic wage pressure. So they saw pilot and flight attendant wages rise. But another thing is just expensive airports, right? So airports in this country with huge capital expenditures can be very expensive to operate from. If you're spending $50 per enplanement out of New York JFK, you can't really live on $79 one-way fares. Right? It just doesn't work out of major airports like that. So the cost pressure that they're facing from airports is a problem with the model. But also, there are several things on the revenue side. Customers have wanted to buy more differentiated products, which airlines hadn't really been selling in the past. There's very little differentiation historically among the major carriers, where they're just selling on schedule and price. And in that world, the low-cost provider is going to win. But where they actually are offering more differentiated projects, and people have wanted that, gradually increasing over the last decade. And so there's business that the Spirits and Frontiers haven't been getting. And the airlines themselves, the major airlines, have been doing a better job doing price discrimination. What they've said is, okay, with basic economy fares, they're not actually trying to get you to buy up from basic economy and spend more money for what you used to get like for free. What they're trying to do is distinguish between high-paying business customers and price-sensitive leisure customers. And they know that the business customers aren't going to buy the highly restricted tickets that don't get advanced seat assignments and other conveniences. And so they can charge more in the way that they used to use 14-day advance purchases, Saturday night stays, as a way of distinguishing those customers, but lost the ability for the most part to do that because of the low-cost carriers. So they've been able to reestablish the price differentiation so they can offer low fares without cannibalizing the high fare tickets that they can otherwise sell. And so they are able to better effectively compete, matching fares of the low-cost carriers while offering, in some cases, a more robust product. And the low-cost carriers don't have partnerships with international airlines. They haven't been able to fly people where they wanted to go after the pandemic, when there was a big rush to Europe. Once Europe reopened, because they don't have these things, their frequent flyer programs aren't as attractive, so you can't redeem your Spirit points to go to Asia in business class. And that makes Spirit's credit card not as lucrative. And the credit cards are a big driver of airline profitability in the US, which I think we're going to talk about as well. And so there is a consumer change, but there's a focus change with Spirit, and there is a post-pandemic cost pressure and airport cost pressure that's creating problems for the model.
You mentioned credit cards. You and other travel writers, and I believe accurately, have described U.S. airlines as credit card vendors with a fleet of planes. Explain what you mean by that.
So take American Airlines, because it's a little bit cleaner and simpler of an example. Because if you stripped out the revenue from selling miles to banks, they would be losing money. Right? They lose money moving planes and selling tickets, and that's true not just selling tickets, but even you add in cargo as well. Put it a different way, you look at their financials. The passenger revenue is lower than their cost per seat mile. Right? So they're losing money just on flying planes. The profit comes from the frequent flyer program. This is incredibly lucrative business. Taking Delta as an example, they're generating over $7 billion a year in revenue from American Express. And there was a lot greater disclosure of the financial performance of the loyalty programs as separate entities during the pandemic, when the largest airlines were raising money against their loyalty programs in the form of debt. So they had to share things about that financial performance. And the largest programs shared margins in their loyalty programs of between 39 and 53%. Right? So you think about $7 billion of revenue, 39% margin, okay? And then that accounts for most of the profit of Delta, but not all of the profit. At American, the sale of miles is more than their profit. And so that isn't to say, I once did a debate with an analyst, a guy named Joe Donardi, who was very well known for popularizing the understanding of the role of loyalty programs in airline financials. And he thought, therefore, that you should be spinning off the loyalty programs, because the loyalty programs are basically worth more than the airline inclusive of the loyalty programs. So maybe the market just didn't properly value these things. I don't think that was quite right. And it didn't work we debated whether we should spin it off. And it turns out that when you do that, you create very bad incentives between the two different entities, which is why Air Canada was the first to spin off its loyalty program 20 years ago. And then they actually wound up buying it back because they couldn't do things like treat their customers well. Their top tier elites were being charged huge change fees on award tickets. And the loyalty program said to Air Canada, oh, you want to change that? Well, just pay us the fee. If you don't want us to charge the $150 per change to your most important customers, give us the $150. And Air Canada's so there were problems. I mean, they tried to write these contracts to align the incentives. It didn't work. But it's also the case that the loyalty program itself wouldn't have value separate from the airline. Frequent flyer programs are the most incredible innovation in marketing ever, in the sense of almost any business in the world has marketing as a cost center, not a profit center. But because people emotionally connect with travel and the idea of free travel, even if there's an opportunity cost to accruing the miles, they will go to great lengths to accumulate these points, and airlines can even sell the points to other companies to use to incentivize business. And so they've created something that is inherently valuable, their own currency, which they control the value of at their own discretion. But also they can make available seats. The original idea was you make available seats that are going to go empty. And those have virtually zero cost to the airline, because once a seat takes off empty, they can never sell it again. Right? So, and the cost of an additional passenger once the plane is flying is next to nothing. Right? There's a little bit of incremental fuel burn from the weight of the person, but it really doesn't cost very much to carry that passenger at all. And so they could take this spoiling inventory and liquidate it through this opaque channel of the frequent flyer program, effectively selling it at a deep discount without cannibalizing the revenue from ticket sales. And that was the idea of the Saver Award. There's much less of that inventory as airlines have gotten better at filling seats. So we don't have 60% load factors where 40% of the seats were empty the way we did when the program started. It's often in the mid 80s. And so a lot fewer empty seats. And so consumers get frustrated trying to redeem their points at low prices that they've come to expect. And so airlines then charge higher prices.
How are the credit card companies and the airlines able to afford the sort of rewards and, in some cases, cashback rates that they do, especially when it comes to the premium credit cards?
Well, so a credit card issuer will be generating revenue from merchant swipe fees, from APR, right? Consumers who are not paying off their bill and financing with the credit card, as well as fees, annual fees being the largest, but other fees on cards as well. And it's a profitable business to be in. And so they want more transactions. The more transactions, the greater revenue they're generating. And so what they're doing is rebating, on average, not talking about the richest rewards or premium rewards or airline rewards, but on average, about 2/3 of merchant swipe fees are rebated to the customer in this country in the form of rewards generally. That includes just an average of cards that don't have rewards. The richest rewards cards will often rebate in the form of benefits as well as points, often 100% or more than the swipe fee to the consumer. What they're doing is they're trying to acquire spending that will generate the APR, as well as these high fees, but also cross-selling other financial services to, in many cases, high-end consumers. So that's why they want to pay the airlines for their miles, that premium customers who are flying, people who are flying tend to have higher incomes. People who are loyal to the brand will want to become loyal to that credit card. It's a way of buying that book of business. It's that marketing expense, and so the airlines make money, the consumers get something they value, and the credit card company gets the gets the charge volume.
Yeah, I think you'd mentioned a statistic that Delta Airlines, in their partnership with American Express for their various cards, that the holders of the Delta Amex cards spend the equivalent of 1% of U.S. GDP on those cards every year.
So Delta came out with a stat that it is that it's approaching 1%, and my math suggests that it's a lot of rounding in that. But it's something like 2/3% or 0.7%, which is, it's order of magnitude approaching $200 billion of charge volume on a Delta product alone. And that's it's grown significantly. In 2018, it was probably 110 billion. Now we've had 20% inflation since then, so that plays a role as well. But that's how it's generating over $7 billion of revenue for Delta each year.
There's been a big debate at the federal level that's starting to trickle down into various states, including Michigan, involving government caps on the interchange fees that credit card companies are allowed to charge. What effects can you foresee if those fees are capped?
So first thing to understand about this is that the cost of payments it varies by different kinds of business, but in many businesses, it's actually cheaper to accept a credit card than to accept cash. And the reason for that is that at a retail store, the clerk makes incorrect change. Clerks also pocket cash, right? And if you're holding a lot of cash, you have risks associated with it. And that can involve security. It can also involve insurance. And so the cost of cash acceptance in some cases is not super high, but in others can be 9% or even higher. And so when you're paying, call it 2.5% on a credit card, that can be like a pretty good deal. It's also the case that the average amount that customers spend is higher when they're paying by credit card, but higher and consumers, it's a convenience. They're not limited by the cash that they have on them at the moment. And so there's that benefit to the merchant as well. Plus it bundles financing, which is a convenience to the consumer. It's expensive financing, but less expensive than some methods as well. So there's often this argument that the swipe fee is rewarding like rich customers who get either rewards at the expense of poorer ones when the price is the same. And in fact, it's often the opposite, right? That because it's more expensive to take cash. Where there is a subsidy involved is the cross subsidy is between customers who don't pay their credit card bills every month and those who do, because those who do get a great deal when the banks are looking for customers who aren't going to. Right, so because often the rewards proposition can be structured in a way that those folks come out ahead, as I say, even getting more than the full value of the interchange, while it's being paid for by people that are financing their monthly charges. So what happens if you cap? Well, first of all, for the airlines, there are airlines who are not making any money without the credit cards. And we can look at what's happened in Europe and Australia, where they have had capped credit card swipe fees, merchant fees. In Australia, for instance, we've seen much higher annual fees on credit cards to consumers, because the financing, the credit cards are not being funded by swipe fees. They've got to be funded by somewhere the consumer pays. And especially for rewards cards, but average annual fees goes up significantly. Now, it was originally written in Australia with some loopholes, the same way that the Durbin Amendment had loopholes in debit interchange caps here in the States. So American Express in Australia wasn't subject to the interchange caps, and everyone just started to issue American Express versions of cards. But when that phased out, we saw a real increase in fees and cost of the consumer credit. Less available credit for consumers is generally not good for the economy. And so you get less economic activity. But what you get for airlines is fewer flights, because Delta talked in their earnings call most recently, their third quarter earnings call, about they're adding flights based on where they think consumers are, where their credit card customers want to go, and where consumers are, where they have the opportunity to add credit card customers. Right? So we have more flights than we would otherwise have. Southwest Airlines, in large measure, originally went to Hawaii, and they were the largest carriers to Hawaii, as well as between the Hawaiian Islands, which frankly provide essential connectivity within the state of Hawaii. You wouldn't have that without credit card rewards. Southwest didn't have international partners. They don't have the sexy destinations in Europe, in Asia for customers to go to, but because the card products are so valuable, they wanted to be able to encourage their members to get the card and spend on the card. We've got to give them Hawaii, right? And that's what drove this desire to fly there and build these services. And so what do you get? You get less, it's like really bad for the state of Hawaii, right? Because you don't have as much travel, and it's also not funded by the rewards. So less flying, less stable airline industry is one area. It's also a redistribution of income from consumers to merchants. As I say, even with cards that don't earn rewards, roughly 2/3 of interchange is being rebated to the consumer today. We also know that, contra retailer claims, in Australia and in Europe, prices did not go down to the consumer when the caps were put in place. Right, so it's just effectively it's redistribution to retailers.
On the topic of rewards, I am a Delta frequent flyer, as a lot of us are captive to here in Michigan. Delta famously gutted its medallion program 2 years ago in what I routinely call the Medallion Massacre. More recently, Southwest Airlines made several unfriendly changes to its Rapid Rewards program and passenger experience. Is airline status dead? And could hotel status be next?
So there's a bunch of things going on. First of all, status, the biggest status benefit with airlines in the US historically, the thing that members valued most, was the upgrade. And in much of the world, upgrades aren't even really a thing. But in the US, they have been. And dialing the clock back 20 years, airlines didn't sell very much first class. About 90% of seats went to awards, upgrades, employees. And that was in part because they were pricing 5 and 6 times what a coach ticket cost. And their technology didn't let them set multiple fares for first class. And that changed, and they began to sell first class tickets at fixed multiples over whatever the lowest coach fare was. You might spend, $150 more for do halfway across the country in first class than you would in coach. And they started selling more of those tickets. And then they started to market to consumers that bought coach tickets. Do you want to upgrade to first class for a discounted price? And that began to sell more of those seats. And they've driven down that price continually, so that I've seen Delta on the shortest flights offer first class upgrades for as little as $25 to the once a year or even less flyer, while their diamond medallions are waiting for an upgrade. United even, I remember getting the offer from United on an Austin-Houston flight. It was $59, but it was pitched as here's the number of elites who are waiting for a free upgrade. Right? I didn't have status. I could jump in front of them, and that was the pitch. Now, I think they're making kind of a blunder when they say we'd rather take $25 from this infrequent customer than reward the loyalty of the person giving $30, $40, $50, $60,000 a year, especially when that's bundled with significant high margin credit card spend. And it also tells me that they may not have enough premium seats. Now, Delta believes that they don't. They've added, more extra legroom seats, which they kind of pitch as their upgrade now, as opposed to just the entitlement of the elites. So they're trying to reframe customer expectations. That's been the most valuable, but it's also now, Delta says that only about 12 to 13% of their seats go to upgrades. And that is across routes, including flights that are not full or not heavily trafficked by very frequent flyers, or they may be flying midweek where they'll have lots of seats available and none when most people want to fly. And so there are routes where you just never get upgraded. So my own view is that mid-tier elite status is more of a sweet spot. You don't expect upgrades, but you confirm those extra legroom seats for the price of coach. You get free bags, you get your priority boarding, so you don't have your carry-on bag taken away from you, right, and checked because there's no room left. So you can board early enough to get the overhead bin space, and you get some priority assistance when flights go bad. So I think there's a value in status, but there's not as much incremental value in the top tier as there once was. That having been said, the very top tier, your Delta 360, United Global Services, American Airlines Concierge Key, is still incredibly valuable. There was a brief time where, because of an offer I took tremendous advantage of at American, I generated a lot of miles and was a Concierge Key member. And it's a great story I can tell you about, but they're willing to bump a passenger to put you on a plane when your flight is canceled or significantly delayed. Like, they'd be willing to pay somebody if they had to the cash compensation of an involuntary denied boarding to put their concierge key member on that plane to get them out. They call it next flight guarantee. I had a flight. I was boarding Austin to Miami, and while we're boarding, they canceled the flight, and so I just called the concierge key line, and they put me on the next. It was sold out Austin Miami flight. Right? Oh, okay, that's great. Right? Turns out at the end of the day, even though there was a wait list to get on the flight, they went out with an empty seat. They didn't actually have to bump someone for it, but they would be willing to start offering compensation. So there's value in those smaller unpublished criteria programs, but I think the sweet spot. Now, as for hotels, I don't see a tremendous benefit in most of the programs. Hyatt's is an exception and only at the top tier. If you're a Hyatt globalist, 60 nights a year, and it's unfortunately they came up with these names like 10 years ago. Some marketing firm they hired, like Explorist, Discover, these don't not like logic. It's not even clear which is better than the other. Terrible names, but they offer actually confirmed suites at time of booking if the suite is available. A certain number of times a year, instead of you're hoping at the front desk, oh, please upgrade me, right? Like the other programs offer, you actually confirm that. So I find a lot of benefit. I have a couple kids with my wife and family. I care about the larger room when we're traveling. I don't want to have to pay for 2 rooms. I can confirm that suite. That's fantastic value for me. So Hyatt program actually delivers a lot.
What's the biggest mistake you see when people are chasing airline or hotel status?
you want to understand what the benefit to you is. I mean, people, there was a time when American Airlines Advantage was so valuable to me that I would start when I needed to go somewhere at American's website, like what were its flights, like period. I'd be upgraded every time. I mean, you wouldn't worry about the economics of the individual trip. You just want every single time go to them. Given that it is no longer as valuable, I'm no longer as loyal to them. And I think the mistake people make is just assuming I am a Delta customer or I am a United customer, instead of looking at the overall, okay, what do I actually need in order to earn that status? What value did that status give me? What is the incremental value of the status on this trip, versus the difference in price versus the schedule, reliability of the connection. I try, because I have a 7-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I work very hard when I have to travel not to leave in the morning before the kids go off to school, and to get home before they're asleep, so that I can do bedtime, right? And so I will pay attention to that more than I will the schedule of my preferred carrier. And I've known plenty of people who just will take the connection on their preferred carrier, get home so much later, and miss family time because they've so bought into that system. And I think you may be making some misjudgments along the way.
We'll get to audience questions in a few minutes. If you have a question for Gary, you pass the cards to the sides of the aisle, and we'll eventually get to those. U.S. airlines have long sought to boost their global networks through airline alliances. United has Star Alliance, American has One World. Delta is a founding member of SkyTeam, but is recently de-emphasized that in favor of joint ventures and cross-ownership of foreign airlines. How do you see these strategies playing out, and which do you see as the model for the future?
So there are legal limits on foreign ownership of U.S. airlines. And the joint ventures are effectively a workaround of that for those limits. Where the joint venture comes from, but to back up and explain what this is, the Department of Transportation grants antitrust immunity to airlines to coordinate their schedules and their prices, and then to share revenue for this flying. And where this comes from, so when you think back to pre-airline deregulation, people misunderstand completely what airline deregulation was. They think, oh, the government's not involved anymore. In fact, airlines are one of the most heavily regulated businesses that there is. Virtually everything about an airline is heavily regulated. Where the government isn't directly the service provider, where local governments in the U.S. mostly own the airports, security being provided by the government, then air traffic control. So the moment the plane pushes back to the moment it comes into the gate, it's the government telling where to go. Everything in the plane is certified and approved by the government. The staffing is dictated by the government. You have to have 1 per 50 seats flight attendants. You have to have 2 pilots in the cockpit. So there's going to come a time, we're not far from it, where AI is going to be better as a co-pilot than like a person, right? But there's heavy lobbying against ever allowing this, right? So it's the government that dictates who is flying the plane, and also who's working the back. You need these flight attendants. So the airlines themselves are heavily intertwined there. So airline deregulation didn't change that. What it did is, before deregulation, airlines used to have their prices and where they could fly to set by the government, right? So the government told them where they could fly and how much to charge. And that's what ended. But internationally, prices were set by collusion at IATA. So International Airline Association set prices. The Airline Deregulation Act gave the Department of Transportation the right to issue this antitrust immunity between U.S. and foreign airlines to set prices, because that was the tradition. So this quirk of the Airline Deregulation Act allows DOT to offer this workaround around foreign ownership restrictions. And where that came from was, the first one was Northwest Airlines. It's now owned by Delta. And the general counsel for for Northwest and for KLM in the Americas, sat down with Don Horn, the Deputy Secretary for International for 37 years at DOT, and basically convinced him that this would be beneficial. And it was consistent with U.S. Foreign policy at the time, because there was a huge drive by the U.S. to get open skies treaties done with other countries. And so we tied the notion of joint ventures to having to have an open skies treaty with the country where the airline is based in. So that's where the joint venture comes from. And so airlines value that coordination much more than the loose affiliation of trading customers with these other airlines. They want to share prices, they want to coordinate schedules and decide who's going to fly where and with which aircraft. Because I may have a plane that is more appropriate for the size of a route than my partner does, I'll fly it. Or it makes more sense for Air France to fly from Paris to a smaller US city or any city that's not a Delta hub than for Delta to do it, because Delta would have to reposition planes and reposition crews if it's not their hub in order to operate out of it. So it's much more expensive for Delta to operate between Paris and its non-hubs versus Air France that can do it all from its hub in Paris. So there are a lot of cost efficiencies that come along with joint ventures. So there's a lot of reasons to prefer the joint venture from the perspective of the airline. And you would have more international airline consolidation if it was legally permissible.
All right. Before I get into your questions, which are very good, by the way, do a few quick hit questions. When choosing a seat on a plane, aisle or window?
I'm aisle. I prefer to control my own destiny. Look, I've looked out of the window plenty of times. I think that's great. Looking out the window is good for a few minutes, but I can lean into the aisle, right? I can get up, without disturbing somebody. That comes with the obligation to get up for anybody. But I also prefer, please don't climb over me in the aisle. I'm happy to get up for you. This is like really awkward. People oh, I'm in the middle seat. Don't worry, I'll just climb over you. And they turn around and they're facing me and there's no face. But nonetheless, I prefer to get up when I want. And because I'm also not usually just sleeping on most flights, I will happily, get up into the aisle. I'm just working versus I don't want to wake somebody if they're snoozing in the aisle seat. So definitely the aisle.
In the main cabin, which passenger gets the armrests?
Well, everybody obviously gets at least one, right? So except where the plane doesn't have the full armrest in the window, right? You don't get it because it doesn't exist. There are some window seats, usually in the exit row of some aircraft, there may be a half an armrest so that the armrest doesn't protrude into the exit for evacuation reasons. But what happens is there's this middle seat that has an armrest on either side, that either armrest could go to the aisle seat passenger or to the window seat passenger. So my view is everyone gets one, middle seat passenger gets two, because the middle seat sucks.
Is it acceptable for the passenger in the aisle seat to stand when the boarding door opens?
It is not just acceptable, it is a moral imperative. Okay, so hear me out on this. People are like, we're all getting off at the same time. That is absolutely sort of true. What you want to do, you've been sitting for the whole flight, right? Why sit longer than you have to? But most importantly, you're sitting in the small seat. Why not take advantage of all the room that the aircraft has to offer? That's not just beneficial to you, but it is the kind and considerate thing to do for the other people in your row, right? So you get out of your aisle seat and into the aisle, or at least you stand up. There's more room for that person who's been crunched in the middle to spread out into the aisle, to take their bag out, put it into the aisle seat that you vacated. Plus, you are more ready to go and get off the aircraft. It gets the planes more quickly. There's no reason to believe that everyone should be on the plane longer than they have to. Right? Anything that you can do to exit quickly. Furthermore, that reduces the amount of time the plane needs to be on the ground, which makes the utilization of the aircraft more efficient, which lowers the airline's cost, which ultimately translates into lower fares. Right, so getting up into the aisle, right, once the seatbelt sign goes off, right, is the right thing to do for yourself, for your neighbors, and for lower fares.
And as a practical matter, if you are in the middle seat next to me, I wear a size 50 suit jacket. I will try to lean into the aisle when the when the card isn't coming through, but having those extra few minutes after a 3-hour flight to unfold your shoulders is something that you will greatly appreciate. And before we get to the audience questions, what advice would you give to somebody on how not to be a jerk on an airplane?
So the interesting thing to me about air travel is it's become a microcosm of society. It's being very small d democratic, right? So before airline deregulation, fares in real terms were substantially higher. They were the province of business travelers and wealthy travelers. And now, without regulated airfares, what that did is drove down fares dramatically. And you have ultra low cost carriers with low fares, and you can organize your schedules around them, and queue longer, or print your own boarding pass, and all these things with these carriers that drive down your cost to travel. And that's made it much more accessible. And so you have different people from all sorts of backgrounds who come on board a plane, and we're stuck inside of a metal tube for hours at a time in close quarters with other passengers. And so we're going to have misunderstandings. You bring with them all of your baggage, whatever happened to you that day, a fight with your spouse, a health problem with your child, or just you drank too much. Okay. And so the thing to do is bring patience and understanding that other people have different perspectives than you do, come from different backgrounds, and we misunderstand each other, and just bring a little bit of grace.
And also don't get wasted before or during the flight. Next quick hit. Should I be concerned about my flight plans around Thanksgiving, Detroit to Orlando? My intel says no. People I'm talking to at the federal level say the politics of the shutdown are rapidly approaching the end, that something will be worked out this weekend. We're post-election, and that matters. We are starting to see real pain for real people, especially more coming tomorrow. There may be some element of that that's even manufactured, but it's real. So I think that'll be solved fairly quickly. But I go back to what I said at the beginning, is that if you're really worried, if you have miles, right, book a ticket on another airline than the one you're scheduled to fly. That's the easiest thing. Book it for several hours later. And so if your first flight cancels and they can't get you on another flight with that ticket, if it cancels, you can always get a refund and then travel on the second one, right? And if it goes, cancel the first one before the flight's scheduled to leave. Book yourself a backup. However, if the shutdown continues, is there an option to surge in military air traffic controllers or controllers from overseas?
No.
What opportunities are...
Not without a change of law, and if we could change the law, we wouldn't have the shutdown.
What opportunities do airlines have for efficiency and profitability through artificial intelligence? I know Delta is claiming that they're using AI to start setting more of their fares.
I should actually asterisk the last comment a little bit when I said no. Military controllers can be used in some cases. In fact, military controllers were used when air traffic controllers illegally went on strike during the Reagan administration. That was part of how they got air traffic back up and running to a small degree, but there's just not enough to make a meaningful enough difference that that's likely. So anyway, sorry, to your next question.
Sometimes I hear of an attempt to bring back a brand that was merged out of existence. Is there any value in returning a Northwest, an Eastern Airlines, or Continental brand for a regional route still owned by present airline?
No. I mean, there's not that much affinity for the brand, and the only thing that it brings is the brand. In fact, I mean, people hated Eastern Airlines. Like, I mean, naming, having a primetime TV show about Pan Am the show didn't last. Okay, like the brand isn't useful. What is useful is an operating certificate, because they're very, very hard to get. The government basically designs things to make it very difficult to start an airline. So when you want to start an airline, usually what you do is you find a mostly defunct airline and buy it. Maybe you don't even want the planes. If they maybe have one plane just to keep the operating certificate, which has value, and then they sell that, because then you can use the manuals and it's already got approval. And if you have an operating, but all these defunct carriers, the operating certificates are gone. on. So no, there's no real brand equity or value in bringing back that airline. There may be value in starting a particular airline with a name, but the airline industry itself is a very difficult, capital intensive, highly unionized, very competitive space, very difficult to make money in.
I'd seen a reel a few days ago about another travel influencer who had taken the one flight a month on the current Eastern Airlines between I think Miami and somewhere in the Dominican Republic. One flight a month. How do you make an airline based on that? And the last question, are there any benefits of being part of the Marriott Bonvoy program?
Are there benefits? Yes. I don't think so I don't find it to be as valuable a program as Hyatt's, but also Marriott has a lot more hotels than Hyatt does. If you're just joining, sure, you get your, you don't have to pay for your internet. I mean, there's like some value in being a member of the program, and accumulate points. They may eventually be worth something. At the higher levels of status, there are benefits. The hotels will honor them much more, to a much greater extent in Europe and in Asia than they will in the US. The experience is generally much better for elite members there. But even at the, say, gold level, a non-convention resort hotel will give you 2 p.m. late checkout. That's better than not having that. So I don't go to great lengths. Look, the platinum level of Marriott, the diamond level of Hilton, these are included with their premium credit cards, which makes them effectively, they're not exactly giveaway levels because you're paying for it, but they're not super difficult to achieve. With the number of people that have that status, there's simply not the benefits to go around where the benefits do trade off. At that platinum level, you're going to get at many hotels, breakfast, right? That's including that has value, especially for families when it's breakfast for multiple people, right? So you get better value on a stay, sure.
Yeah, if this was your question about the Bonvoy program, find me afterwards. I am making a run at Titanium this year. But since we are out of time, please give Gary a round of applause. Thanks all of you for being here today, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great afternoon.